My name is Terry David, and I'm proud to say that I'm a member of the percussion section with the Hutchinson Symphony Orchestra. Originally, in the Wichita school system, I grew up in Wichita, and in the Wichita school system, you couldn't get into music, in instrumental music, till you were in sixth grade. And originally, I wanted to play saxophone. Maybe because music in the 50s and the early 60s had a lot of saxophone in it, and I thought that was kind of sexy. So all the saxophone players can have a thumbs up with that. But I had asthma real bad, and so I probably didn't have the breath control to do it. My grandmother, my parents were never into music. In fact, I can't remember my parents ever playing anything on a radio or a phonograph at home. And but my grandmother, who lived very, very close to us, was interested in helping me do what I wanted to do. And so we went to Jenkins Music Company. And I can tell you today, I can't tell you the streets, but I can take you to the building because it's still there in Wichita, a great big huge place. And it was a huge music store, 2 levels. And so I ended up getting a Ludwig snare drum. And this was when I was probably 11 years old, 10 or 11 years old. And in fact, I still have that snare drum. And so my grandmother bought me the snare drum, and I guess the rest is pretty much history. So I played in the percussion section during junior high school, our high school and junior high school. I went to a really large high school. We had 2 orchestras and 3 bands. We had an hour of percussion ensemble. So I went to Wichita South, and we had there were 1,200 people in my graduating class. So we had a huge student body, and so lots of music programs. And so, and probably the most influential thing that happened is when I got to be 12 years old, I got into one of the Wichita Drum and Bugle Corps. And I stayed in Drum and Bugle Corps until I aged out at the age of 21, and ended up being the corps director for several years, and ended up teaching drum lines for several years. And so that's kind of the stepping stone. I moved to Hutchinson, I believe, in 1979 to go in the police department. I was on the Wichita Police Department, and I decided to come over here and go to work. And coincidentally, when I came over here and moved over here, a good fine gentleman by the name of Dean Lippincott was playing in the percussion section in the symphony. And he and I had marched in drum corps together over in Wichita. And he had married a drum corps girl by the name of Renee, and she was playing French horn in the symphony. So rest is pretty much history. So that was many, many years ago. In fact, my first season was 79-80. So I moved over here in 79, and I have a program. An interesting side note, I have probably every program from every concert since 1979. So in fact, I just started going through them at home when we got talking about doing this interview. So I got in the symphony right after I moved to Hutchinson, and have been with the symphony in some form or other since that time. And I think, as I told you when I filled out my pre-interview form, that I guess that now makes me the longest member associated with the orchestra, which was kind of hard to accept, I guess, from an age perspective. I play a municipal band in Hutchinson in the summertime as well, and the same goes true. There's only so many numbers that people play, and so over the years, and it's interesting when you look at all of the pieces that the symphony has played over the years, the 40 years I've been involved in it, there's been lots of repeats. And that's of course driven by whatever conductor you have, and what they think, what the board and he come up together to think that is going to appeal to the audience. So there's been a lot of repeats. To answer your question specifically, how I balance those, my private life and that, I always felt that the orchestra was a community orchestra, and I'll probably get hate mail for this, but I originally was going to be in music. In fact, when I first went to Wichita State, I was in the music program, and frankly wasn't good enough to make a living as a performer. And no offense to all my musical colleagues, but didn't want to be a music educator. And so I ended up going completely different and got involved in public safety on police departments, and I've been a paramedic for 30 years, and so I went that route when I moved to Hutchinson. And I thought it was the perfect hobby. I mean, it wasn't hard to balance the two. One of the benefits, and I tell kids this, all my kids have played musical instruments, but do not play them now. When I have an opportunity to educate younger people, I always tell them, you never see a 67-year-old softball player, but you see lots of people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s that still play musical instruments and get a huge amount of pleasure out of that. And we've had people in the orchestra in their 80s over the years that have played. We had a retired superintendent from the Pratt school system that drove over here and played second violin. Wasn't the most outstanding player, but held his own, did it for the pure pleasure of playing. And so he's the perfect example, and he played probably, I think, until he passed away in his late 80s, and he continued to play in the symphony. So I find it easy to do that because it's not necessarily something I have to live with every day like a music educator would have to do. I played in the orchestra for many, many years, and then as the orchestra became more professional with more funding and raised the level, performance level, the board was very progressive in the fact that at that time there was a number of influential people on the board. Linda Dillon was on the board. One of the Careys was on the board. One of the Krauses was on the board. Old Hutchinson people that made Hutchinson what it was. Those people were on the board of directors of the symphony. And so I ended up becoming, and I don't remember how it happened, I worked in the production part of it. We actually hired production people at that time to set the stage, to make everything was okay. And so they got to the point that they wanted to hire somebody to do it on a more full-time basis or part-time basis. And interestingly enough, I was working as a paramedic at Hutchinson Hospital, so I only worked 10 days a month. And so I applied for the job and was lucky enough to get the position. And I did that. I'm referring to the history here. I started in 83 and 84 as part of the production staff, and then in 90 I became the general manager and did that until I moved to Lyons to take the job as EMS director in Rice County in 1995 or 96. I didn't play in the orchestra at that time because I literally hired and fired all the musicians. I oversaw the conductor because they reported to me rather than the board, and so I didn't want a conflict, particularly with the people in the orchestra, and it gave me a little bit of a separation as far as being the guy that was in charge. I probably wouldn't be doing it today because I probably couldn't afford to do it. Back then our funding was a little better, but that's kind of how that happened. And then after I moved to Lyons, which is where I live now, I just wanted to continue to play. So I come over, and like I said, I still play a municipal band, and I play the musical every year with the children or the family theater, and still try to be involved in it as much as I can in different places. One of the questions that has been asked me by several people is what was one of the odd things that happened to you as when you were the general manager of the symphony. And one of my jobs as the general manager was to make sure everything was perfect, both for the musicians and the conductor at concerts in wherever we were at. And as an interesting side note, we haven't always played at the Fox. I remember as general manager going into the Fox when it was empty and was close to being torn down. And a group of people that were involved with the progressive Fox group at that time that wanted to refurbish the theater brought all the people in that they think that was going to use the theater, including the symphony. And of course, the chairs were all gone, and the chandeliers were gone, and the paint was all falling off the walls. And so I remember that very well because all of us could see what that was going to be. And I committed at that time, I think the symphony could make this their home. We played concerts at Convention Hall. We played concerts at Stringer Fine Arts Center. We played concerts at Memorial Hall downtown. One of the most interesting things that happened in trying to get prepared is the conductor showed up to the concert, and conductors sometimes are at an anxiety or stress level before they do their job, which is understandable. The conductor showed up in his tuxedo and, of course, had full tails on and the entire thing, and was wearing white socks. And he came to me and he says, "We got a problem." And I'm thinking, "No." And he looked down and he says, "Look." I said, "Well, they go with your shirt." And I think he had a white tie on too. I said, "They match your shirt and your tie." I said, "I'll tell you what, let me take mine off." I had black socks on. And I said, "Let me take mine off and you put them on, and I'm not putting yours on, but let me fix you up here." So that actually happened down in the dressing room, is that I ended up taking my black socks off and giving to him, and he put the socks on. And as they say, the show went on, and everything went fine. As far as favorite numbers, I would tell you that percussionists generally are lonely people. Because over the years, I've sat in the back through entire concerts and hit maybe 3 notes on a triangle at the end of a number. And one thing you have to be proficient in being a percussionist, you have to be able to learn to count well, because sometimes we have hundreds of measures of rest before we hit a single strike of a cymbal or something such as that. So, it's an interesting place to be, but it gives me the opportunity to listen to the orchestra from a different perspective as well. As to what is favorite, I don't necessarily have. I take my favorite composer is probably Rimsky-Korsakov, because he writes lots of percussion stuff. I don't have I think my favorite time is, when the Fox has sometimes performers come in, they hire orchestra people to help, provide the orchestra with whoever the performer is. The first time that Art Garfunkel came, they hired quite a few people in the orchestra to play, and I played timpani. And it was actually a wonderful, wonderful experience. Art came in, and for people that aren't familiar with Art Garfunkel, he has a huge history of writing books and degrees and different things other than music. We had a dress rehearsal at about 2 in the afternoon. He came in and only worked certain pieces for maybe 10 or 20 minutes at a time, and the rest of the concert we sight read that night. And he brought a drummer with him who is well known in the New York City scene as a jazz studio drummer, really good. And he brought I think he brought a pianist with him, maybe a guitar player. And the symphony, from the conductor to all the rest of the members of the orchestra, provided the backup. That's probably, that was one of those times where, you can say, gosh, I actually got to play with Art Garfunkel and meet Art Garfunkel, and he was just as gracious as can be. I think probably the Nutcracker. We used to do the Nutcracker every year, and I've always enjoyed doing that, and I think for the entire group of musicians, it's a tough it's tough to play. We partnered with the American Heart Association one year and had a ball while I was the manager. And Betsy Andrews had ball dancing classes. So people could go before the event, weeks out, on I think a Sunday afternoon, and have dancing lessons on how to do the tango and the waltz. And this was a big dressy up affair. It was a fundraiser for the Red Cross, and it was well attended. And I I remember dancing the waltz with my wife because I wasn't in the orchestra. And it was to the point that some professional ballroom dancers from Wichita that compete actually came over and helped support the event, and that was fun. We've got good memories of that. You know, I think sometimes percussion people are sometimes the forgotten part of the orchestra, um, because their role, for the most part, is so supportive. It's interestingly enough that percussion is the oldest part of an orchestra. There's evidence that percussion has existed since 6000 BC by all the major civilizations back then. And of course, if you could go back even further, I'm sure that when man first came out of the cave and found a stick and could hit a log, he figured out that it made sounds. And the rest probably is history. So, I think it would be hard pressed to say that any other instrument other than instruments in the percussion family would be, be the oldest. It's interesting because the first modern percussion instrument in the timpani was the timpani. And it actually came from battlefield. You'll see movies with horses with drums on both sides. That's where the timpani actually started, was on the backs of horses, and they were used to announce movements within the army in the field. And of course, during the Civil War, the drums were a very, very important part of moving troops and having troops on the same page of music, so to speak. It's interesting that, and I brought some different things, there's some interesting things about percussion is that they currently think that there's about 500 different percussion instruments. And I would tell you that the last musical we did with Family Theater, which was Suzuka, and I'd never heard of the musical Suzuka, there was 3 of us that played in the percussion part, and the percussion part had 40 instruments in it. In fact, I ended up buying, I'll show you one of that I bought, that a lot of the times, most musicians, there's significant cost involved, of course, with all the musicians, but in the percussion section, I think you could probably go through your entire life and A, not have them all, and B, continue to spend money your entire life, at least in my case, because when it calls for something and I can't find it, I go buy it. I think that's kind of an interesting story. And I was surprised, I actually looked it up, that there was 500 different kinds of percussion instruments. Four most commonly used instruments in the percussion section in a symphony orchestra are timpani, of course, and there's lots of pieces where the timpani is the only part that is written, but bass drum, snare drum, and cymbals. And so I brought some samples of some things, and interesting enough, I mentioned earlier that I have the original snare drum that my grandmother bought for me back in whenever. I've got about 6 other snare drums as well, and they're all used for different purposes, of course, but as I said a little earlier, I don't think you can ever totally have everything, or you don't have the room. Our good friend Ginger Zakowski, that had professional drum school here in Hutchinson, of course, had an entire house full of percussion instruments, and some from Africa in addition to the regulars. But I brought a few things. These things are all, of course, bass drum mallets, and I probably have a total of about 50 pairs of sticks total. And since the bass drum is a common instrument used for various things, I brought some sticks, and a stick like that's $65. Different things, you can feel that this is a very large, soft mallet for softer passages, and then of course if you want to make more of an impact and get the audience attention, you can use something a little stronger, the head's a little stronger, and then of course there's lots of pieces written now that have roller passages in them that that simulate maybe deep thunder or something within the piece. And of course, these are rollers that you can actually roll and make that happen. So tambourines and triangles are both interesting instruments, is that they have both been around since the 1300s, and they actually started in Egypt and the Middle East and were used mostly in religious ceremonies. Mozart, Haydn used the triangle quite frequently as they got into that period of music. They started to use those triangles particularly, and I'll show you that. But tambourines are, you know, just like you see, tambourine. The thing is, you know, that you can make different, you can hit loud sounds, you can hit soft sounds. There's actually a thing called a thumb roll, if I can do it, like that makes them jingle. Or there's pieces where it's just typical gypsy type. These cost anywhere. This one was about $80. They range in price from probably $75 to over $200. So when we go out and start buying this stuff, you know, it can turn into a little bit of money. The triangle, again, was an Egyptian instrument. This one is specifically made for symphonic work. As you can tell, it's not quite like a regular triangle, and you pay for that. It's interesting. They originally were solid pieces, and then they eventually started taking this part out, or lifting it out, so that you wouldn't have a specific pitch. If you left it all intact, it would generally have a specific pitch. You can get different things out of them by using different size instruments. Whereas if you use a bigger one, it's a little bit the same, but a little different. Interestingly enough, this instrument is probably the most pronounced instrument in the orchestra. Regardless of what's going on in the orchestra, a person playing the triangle, that sound will permeate through the orchestra and the audience can hear it. Which is, there's actually a piece, and I forget the name, that they have where one of the movements is called the triangle, what's the word I'm looking for?
Concerto?
Concerto, yeah. It's called the Triangle Concerto. So we haven't played that, but anyway. So that's the triangle, and as you can tell, this instrument is right at $100. These beaters are graphite lined, and each one of them has a little bit different sound. If you can see up close, you've got,
I'm going to zoom in for a second.
You've got, the center is silicone and graphite. They're very, very, very light. They come in different sizes. And of course, again, when you purchase them, this set here I think was like $85. I mean, so all in all, I probably have literally thousands of dollars worth of stuff. I mean, this thing is not used in orchestra, but it's called a vibroslap. And I think this is a piece that I actually bought for the Suzuka. And you see some of these in band literature. It's, you know, you hang on to it and you go, that's all it does. But some pieces call for that. And interestingly enough, the modern part of this did not come into the percussion world until in the 60s. And before that, in African tribes, where that sound came from is by hitting an animal head and hearing the teeth rattle. So, and as I said, it's not an orchestral instrument, but of course, percussion people can, you know, play in many, many different kinds of different venues.
Well, that's cool.
So anyway, that's some of the stuff I brought to kind of share, and I probably could have filled 3 tables like this with all kinds of stuff that I've bought. So.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's interesting because just by you is a percussion instrument, and that is an old-fashioned typewriter.
typewriter.
There's actually a piece.
Really?
There's actually a piece called the typewriter,